friends. Welcome to the Center for Global Studies video logs that we're beginning to start with. And for starters, we have today Dr. Florian Kuhn of the University of Gottenburg, Sweden. Dr. Kuhn, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
How would you rate the NATO involvement in Afghanistan? Would you rate it as a complete failure, something that wasn't even warranted, the expedition in the first place? Or would you consider it at least a partial success for the job that was done?
Well, it depends on how, on which aspect you put emphasis. If you look at the political coherence and the political process of organizing a mission like this one, NATO wasn't entirely unsuccessful. NATO, after all, is not a core military alliance, but it is a political alliance regarding military and security policy. So what NATO does and what NATO is best at is coordinating political interests of its member states and, in a sense, relating them to positions and perceptions of people who are not member states, not of people, but of states who are not members. Now, for that political process, NATO was pretty successful in the first decade, I would say, in organizing a lot of support for the mission and how it went, in organizing a large military operation, which was a huge challenge for NATO, which had not done that kind of thing before. So in that sense, NATO was successful, NATO as an organization. Now, politically speaking, NATO now seems to have lost. But what happened was that NATO's disadvantage or NATO's failure in the second decade of the mission was really a symptom of NATO member states moving away from political coordination within NATO. That showed in 2013, actually, when the US and Great Britain decided bilaterally that they would leave ISAF and that they would end ISAF. And then they went to the NATO summit to inform their NATO member colleagues. So it wasn't an inclusive NATO consultation that led to this decision, but it was a decision that was made by the lead nation, the US, in consultations with the British, and then announced it. So from that, we see that the limited or limiting interest of NATO member states in using NATO as a coordination mechanism started much earlier now. Now, the withdrawal that we have seen and the chaos that it unfolded in was certainly not a particularly well executed military maneuver, to say the least. But it is not entirely NATO, or it's not at all NATO's fault, but it is the member states who put their military considerations before the political alliance considerations. So in that sense, we have a military and we have a political aspect to keep in mind when we talk about failure and success here.
But NATO relies militarily so much on the US for heavy lifting. Isn't this kind of a problem built into the structure of the organization? Do you see any rethink likely on this dependence on US for this heavy lifting? Because the US, whenever it chooses, it walks in, whenever it chooses, it walks out, and it carries the NATO in and it carries the NATO out.
I wouldn't like to be splitting hair here, but it's the structural situation NATO is in is one of equal membership, but in fact the way power and military capabilities are distributed, it is highly uneven, and that I think is the problem, that there's a political illusion, but that's not really there with practitioners, but in public opinion. NATO members actually think and portray themselves as equal members, which they are not. And I think here lies, obviously, I mean, you're pointing to the key to the problem. The Europeans need to reconsider what would they be doing and what would they find desirable if the US didn't want to do any heavy lifting any longer in the future. At the same time, we have seen in the last 3 decades more, that the Americans have actively tried to dissuade the Europeans of unitarizing and generalizing their defense capabilities. So there's a political aspect to it as well, where the Americans weren't entirely, while calling for more European engagement, they were unhappy to see the political integration move along in this regard. So it's a bit of a vague politics on the side of the Americans, and it has led also to a rather vague politics by many European, particularly the bigger and more powerful European countries, because they have used this vagueness for their own political maneuvers. So it would be expanding this conversation to many hours to disentangle the different countries' positions, because we had France rejoin NATO after several years and so on. So there was a lot of there were a lot of aspects that played over the years into this kind of vague security situation. All that said, the summary really is the European countries will have to look at what they want to do in terms of security. And my hunch is that there is very little interest in, getting engaged in missions abroad, as we are seeing now with France openly questioning the mission in Mali and so on. So the age of Western European interventionism seems to be all but over.
But one of the good things that happened to Afghanistan, if anything happened good for Afghanistan, is that the international community's efforts at capacity building. For 20 years at least, Afghans, maybe only in urban pockets, but Afghans in urban pockets got exposed to the vision of a world, exposed to structures that they never had tasted before. So do you think that any of these would prove durable? I mean, the quality of the hospital, the healthcare, the education, albeit in pockets, but do you think any of these is going to prove durable?
That's very difficult to say. Durability very much depends on sustainable finance, and that obviously points to the problems the Taliban or any other Afghan government will have in the future. Currently, or in the last 2 decades, most of these structures or services that you point out have been foreign funded, and it's very difficult to say if Afghanistan will be able to organize and muster this kind of challenge by itself, financially speaking. In terms of ideas and organization, I don't see why Afghanistan wouldn't preserve some of those developments. At the same time, when you said people were exposed to this and got to engage with these ideas, it may be that the rift between certain middle-class, educated urban Afghans and the countryside would get even bigger, precisely because this democratic experiment failed so miserably from the view of many Afghans that I've spoken to. But that's not how it ended. But that manifested itself over at least 10 years with rigged elections, with corruption, with favoritism and patronage networks taking over most of state activity. So in fact, under the guise of democracy, there was a highly elitist oligarchy taking over the state, really delegitimizing the very idea of democracy, because people said, well, okay, how can the Western intervention tolerate this kind of behavior, even encourage it for security reasons in many cases, without taking these people to account and without really actually pressing for good governance, as was announced most of the time. I mean, in recent years, talk about good governance became a little less pronounced, facing the situation, but that is telling us, well, why did the Western donors continue to fund an administration that they have known for many years to not be legitimate, to not be reliable, to not be engaging in good governance, which accepted tacitly or actively the abuses of the general population by police and military and economic actors. So there's a negative side effect of this kind of corruption, as it was accepted, because it delegitimized the whole idea.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kuhn, for your time. It was wonderful having you.
Very welcome.